Good afternoon and welcome to Generous Futures, Creating Equity and Access in Tech. My name is Abdullah Snowbar and I'm the Executive Director of the DMZ and the CEO of DMZ Ventures at Toronto Metropolitan University. We're super excited about this panel today and we can't wait to dive right in. Before we do that, I'd like to start off with the land acknowledgement and acknowledge that Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon territory is a treaty between the Anishinaabe Mississaugas and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our lead sponsor of this series, TD Bank Group, for helping advance these important discussions. TD Bank Group has been a great supporter of Toronto Met, and we're delighted that they have joined us on this journey of understanding. Today, we are here to explore why the tech ecosystem needs to address its diversity challenges head on, how we can tackle this issue in a collaborative and meaningful way, and what we can actually accomplish when we put our equity and accessibility at the forefront of our ecosystem and close the digital divide. I have the honor of hosting today's event, and I'm thrilled to be joined by rock stars, and you will see why I say that word after I have the chance to ask the panelists some questions today. And time permitting, we're going to have a chance to dive into some deeper questions and have the panelists respond to questions from you, the audience, which is going to be fantastic. So I'm now delighted to introduce you to our panel of leaders. So first and foremost, Arti Sharma is an entrepreneur, angel investor, and technology leader based right here in Toronto. She is the founding partner of Backbone Angels, an investor collective led by women executives from Shopify. Arti invests in companies and brands that are led by women and people of color, with the aim of increasing representation and equitable access to resources for entrepreneurs of all backgrounds. She is also, if that wasn't enough, she is also a co-founder of Glee, a modern day beauty brand offering natural products rooted in South Asian tradition. So welcome, Arti. Next, we have Jacqueline Jennings. Jacqueline is an impact investment professional, a decolonial facilitator, and an entrepreneurial educator around the country. Currently as a venture partner at Raven Indigenous Capital and as the director of the Fireweed Fellowship, she supports the flow of support and of venture capital in Canada and the US to Indigenous and Native American entrepreneurs historically excluded from equity investing due to systematic oppression while taking a trauma-informed approach. Welcome, Jacqueline. And finally, we have Isaac Oluwafi Jr., who is a real estate entrepreneur, angel investor, philanthropist, and general partner at Bkr Capital. Isaac's corporation, Dreammaker Inc., successfully operates multiple divisions, including a brokerage, real estate development, wealth management, property management, education, private equity, and insurance. Isaac, we got to talk about what you're not in after this. But in addition to his mentorship in the Toronto Met Innovation Circle, Isaac has made a number of generous donations, notably naming an educational space in the Student Learning Center at TMU, and has also played an integral role in DMZ's Black Innovation Programs as an inaugural founding partner. So welcome to you, Isaac. And let me tell you, I'm very excited about this group of incredibly established individuals. So why don't we dig right into it and kind of get started? So I'm going to ask the same question to everybody on the panel. Maybe we can just start off with Arti, and we'll see where that leads. But within the tech ecosystem, we know that not everyone begins at the same starting line. Many face various barriers and obstacles to be able to access resources needed to succeed. So in your own words, why is this topic so important to discuss now and more than ever before? So Arti, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thanks so much for having me today, everyone. I'm also equally excited for this chat. I think, obviously there's so much going on in the world right now, and it's just so apparent how important it is that women and diverse voices are involved in building the products that we all use. But for me personally, why it's so important to have representation across all different fields, peoples, humans, is we are building products that are so integrated into everything we do now. And those can't be made by a few folks because there's so much inherent in assumptions that go into building technology, right? We're trying to figure out what are the baseline algorithms to then get smarter and smarter. But if those baselines don't include how we all live in different ways, we're just not going to build the proper tools that essentially end up governing our lives, right? I think early on in the tech ecosystem, we were building very niche products, right? Maybe they were for a select group of folks that were more tech savvy or for enterprises. But now everything is a technology product, everything is a technology company. And so if we don't start off with the people actually making those products being diverse from different backgrounds, we're just not going to make the right tools. So even though, this is about social justice for me, it's also a business decision because how are we going to build products that are going to serve all these different audiences, customers, regions, etc.? So that's why I believe that, like, more than ever, it's time to ensure that diverse voices and people have a place in building these tools and technology.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the theory that it's not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. And I think you've kind of combined the business aspect with the accessibility aspect as well. And I couldn't agree more. And something we'll dig a bit more into in a few seconds. Jacqueline, can I just maybe pass the same question over to you?
Absolutely. I just want to start off by saying I know that this week has been super terrible for many of us. And so I'm going to name some things that might be triggering to the audience: racialized violence and patriarchy. So I just want to say, like, shields up. This is your verbal trigger warning. So I think, RT really named the piece that's really important is that this isn't just the right thing to do. It's a good business decision. But I just want to say we often talk about the specific barriers in place for diversity, that founders and ventures find: access to capital, and access to networks, credibility, and experience. But we often don't dig into why those barriers exist in the first place. And I think in tech, we understand that if there's a bug, we need to uncover the error or the broken link or the bad code. And there's a lot of well-meaning folks out there in tech and finance who talk about all these perceived remedies without really understanding the problem or uncovering the truth of how we got here and the forces that are keeping these things in place. 500 years of patriarchal, capitalistic colonization is a lot to digest. But if we don't understand the truth, truly understand the systemic problem we are trying to solve for, anything we do is half measures or a Band-Aid. We have an entire economy built on violently stolen lands cleared through policies of extermination and the enslavement and forced labor of stolen people, which, by the way, did not end with the so-called end of slavery, but was rolled into the US industrial prison system and continues today as forced labor. And the way that inhumanity was normalized is we had Europeans arriving from their homelands at a time when women were still considered property. And where slight differences in Christianity, the way one practiced, were grounds for prosecution and execution. So we also had, simultaneously British were invading what is currently known as India and Pakistan. So this was business as usual. And a lot of those beliefs and ways of being have continued for 500 years. There's a lot of intergenerational trauma wrought by the system, by the oppressed, by the oppressors, and by the bystanders. So I think really digging into what got us here today is really critical in moving forward.
I appreciate that context, Jacqueline. I think it's important to look at the past as well to understand why we are where we are today, and maybe not a context we always speak about. So really appreciated. Isaac, maybe we can turn it over to you just to get your take on it as well.
Yeah, no, I think to add to the two comments that were mentioned, especially RT, what you mentioned, that technology over the last couple of years we've seen has gone from just being utilized by those that are specialists in the technology space and by business, but in our everyday lives. And we're now seeing the impact of even AI when it comes to security. So then it comes back to who is creating that AI, who is behind on the development side. And if there's not representation from a gender point of view and a racialized point of view in the creation of that data, the creation of that product, you'll see it in the end result. And you'll see how it interacts with other diverse communities and other diverse individuals that are trying to utilize the same product. And we saw all throughout COVID, the impact of technology on all different communities, all different walks of world, all different genders. So it's important now that any technologies that's developed and built and rolled out has representation. And that's part of the reason why we got in about 7 years ago, mainly because we saw technology really making an impact across all industries. And the fact that we didn't see representation from our community. So we wanted to make a change to that.
That's fantastic. And it's amazing that we're talking about product and product design and how to make sure that people are included in these discussions. And it makes me think of a funny story with my family. I run the DMZ, which is a tech incubator headquartered in Toronto. My father is trying to understand this concept and he still has not gotten to the point of understanding it fully. So at family gatherings, they say, Omar, what does your son do? He's like, well, my son builds and disassembles computers for a living. And and it makes me think like how much more deep we got to go in terms of supporting. My father is in his 80s, so it's obviously something that he's not kind of completely conceptualizing. But when I think about sometimes product and product design and whatnot, how do you make sure that even my father can be included so that he can understand how to leverage some of these technologies so he's not left behind as well and build in what's being built and what's being distributed. But in any event, look, this is what an awesome opening, and I love hearing from you all, and it's leaders like you that are going to help us progress in creating a more inclusive, equitable tech ecosystem. So I want to dig a bit deeper into each of your own verticals. So maybe RT, we can probably start with you. Backbone Angels. So it's an investor collective led by women executives from Shopify that looks to fund and empower founders, businesses, and ideas that are often excluded. And I use this word deliberately, something that we've talked about before. Can you please tell us a bit more about the collective and what led you to co-founding this important initiative and what you've learned so far?
Yeah, we've been around for about a year and a half now, and it's been a little bit of a wild journey for us. So the 10 of us were early women executives at Shopify, and we started Backbone Angels because we were already giving back in other ways. We were mentoring, we were sitting on boards, we were advising. But one thing that we all kind of collectively noticed, the 10 of us who were, a group of friends who were each other's comrades and sometimes the only women in the room. And what we noticed was we were being asked for a lot of mentorship and advice, but we weren't necessarily seeing decks or deal flow or being asked to invest. And our male counterparts, and I often talk about this all the time, is my husband is also a senior leader in tech, and he would get a lot of decks and deal flow, and I would get questions for advice, and I'd be like, wait, I want to invest monies too. And so that was kind of the impetus, which is I feel like there's so many different groups out there to support women. And oftentimes it's like get ready to raise or mentorship or advice, but not too many that actually will write the check. And so when the 10 of us got together, we thought, hey, why wouldn't we be the group that actually writes the check? And there's two reasons for this. One is we believe that to have the systemic change that we want, we obviously need more women entrepreneurs. Like that's a no-brainer. And in fact, we've always had women entrepreneurs. If you look at folks that are often outside of the corporate, ladder or the rigmarole of like the career professionals, it's often racialized people, women of color, because we don't necessarily succeed in those traditional environments. So women have always been entrepreneurs. But have they been funded the same ways? No. Are they in the media the same way? No. Do they wear a hoodie all the time? Probably not. When you Google search what an entrepreneur looks like. So, I mean, no brainer that we need more women entrepreneurs to create better environments and better technology. But the other thing that we need is we need more women on cap tables. And, Jacqueline kind of hinted to this in terms of women having control over their own money. And I speak to a lot of women who their husbands or their partners are often asked to become investors or go in on deals. But the women often don't get asked. And so this is all about agency over your own money. And I think the more that we have women on cap tables, the more that we will have wealth creation for women and women having control over their money. And also women on cap tables also ensures more women in board seats. So that's essentially why we started Backbone Angels, is we need women representation across the board. And the 10 of us just feel so strongly about that.
Do you think that Backbone has really kind of set the stage to allow more women to be able to establish their funds and kind of open up, and have you been able to leverage maybe a bit of a network around this? Is that something that you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely. I'll say this: when we launched a year and a half ago, it was the International Women's Day, and I remember when we were coming up with our launch plan, and I'm kind of the marketer of the group. We all have our different skill sets, and I naively said, it's International Women's Day. No one's going to pay attention to what we're doing. There's so many programs, there's so many things out there. And when we launched, we were humbled because so many people were interested in Backbone Angels, but also it made me a little bit sad because I was like, how is this still novel? Like, how is investing in women still a novel concept? And so it did create a lot of momentum. We have had a lot of really, really great people reach out to us, and we've definitely created a network around women investors. But I'm just still surprised that this was a big deal. Like, we didn't think this would be like a big new deal. So I'm glad if we've created any momentum. I'm glad if we've, ruffled some feathers, and definitely connected with a lot of women who've already been doing the work for a really long time. That's what we thought. No one would pay attention to us because we thought, hey, there's the 51, and then there's these other groups that are already out there doing it.
Yeah. No, look, truth be told, even when you folks announced it, there's a lot of excitement in the DMZ space as well. So I got to tell you, part of it is the fact that it's needed. There's got to be more of this. But the other part of it was who was behind this. And that was actually a really exciting factor. So congrats to you and everything that you guys have been able to accomplish so far.
Thank you. I mean, we've had a great year too. Last year, we invested in 42 companies and deployed over $2.3 million. And we didn't know 42 was a big number until we started to talk to our VC counterparts. And it turned out to be a big number. So that was great.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Jacqueline, if I can maybe just steer over to you, can you just tell us a bit more about the work that you're doing through Raven Indigenous Capital and the Fireweed Fellowship? How important is it to guide the flow of support and venture capital to Indigenous and Native American entrepreneurs? And what's at risk if we don't? And again, an interesting question based on the history that you just spoke about. What's at risk if we don't do this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that I think about broadly flow of capital to diverse founders from a gender perspective and a racialized perspective, and disabled, neurodivergent. There's a lot of things. I'm conscious that in a lot of tech conversations, we tend to focus on this binary of men or women, and there is a lot more diversity out there. So I just raise that because I firmly believe that our liberation is tied to one another. There's a lot of research out there that have that diverse teams create measurably better solutions, as we've all known. So what my work with Raven Capital looks like is we're the only Indigenous-led venture fund in the world. We raised a $25 million fund that was actually initially thought to potentially be an exploratory fund in 2020 of maybe 5 million, but the LPs kept lining up. We also thought it would only be in Canada, but we were sort of ushered into the US market as well. And next week we'll have our first close of our second fund. We're raising 75 million, which will be deployed 50% in Canada and 50% in the US. In our second fund, we'll make about 19 deals. We've made 17 and 11 companies. We like to do follow-on funding because most of we're usually the first money in, and most of our entrepreneurs have had not an ideal experience raising with other with other groups. So we like to get in there and guide the flow of capital. We're very hands-on. We do impact investing, so it looks a little bit different. It's quite founder friendly, and we say we're profit seeking, not profit maximizing, because our work is firmly entrenched in economic reconciliation. We have the most incredible group of LPs who are very much on board. We're seeing this appetite from our LPs not only to invest in ESG, but to invest in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in our case with UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and in Canada, the work around truth and reconciliation. So that's enabled us to raise these two funds. We have gender parity at the moment in our Fund 1, which is pretty unusual, I would say. 50% of our founders are women-led or have a woman co-founder. We have one queer founder in our portfolio. And all of the companies that we invest in are making a difference in our communities. So we have sort of a line where we say, for every dollar we deploy, we need to see a straight line to the increased well-being of our people. So within our portfolio, Virtual Gurus, which is it started out as a marketplace to access online virtual assistants, has grown tremendously. And Bobby Reset, the CEO of that company, is the first Indigenous woman to ever raise a Series A. We're very proud to have been a part of that as our third investment in Virtual Gurus. And what Bobby is doing is actually providing incredible, high quality, well-paying jobs for rural community members, a lot of whom are Indigenous. So we're seeing, an increased well-being of not only those employees, but their families. And as well as they've developed an academy to train up more rural assistants. So, that's just one example, but I could go through our whole portfolio. All of them are coordinating this lift, and that's what's possible. We have a lot of data around biodiversity that's held by Indigenous communities, like 85% of the world's biodiversity. So we haven't even sort of scraped the surface of what's possible from a climate change perspective. Whenever I think about this, I think about when they first started developing and deploying airbags. And the first ones went to market, and unfortunately women and children started dying in accidents at an increased rate. And it was when they backtracked through the system and the design, they realized they'd forgotten to test them on women and children because the design team was entirely men. And, literally people will die if we don't diversify our organizations, the flow of capital. But I also want to name that, PitchBook released their new stats, particularly around capital being deployed to women. And pre-pandemic, things were looking slightly better. We were moving from like 2% to 2.1 to 2.3. Well, we're back to 1.8. And so what we're learning is that women's representation in VC and PE, white, cis, hetero women, are actually not moving capital in the direction of diverse founders as we thought that they would. So I think we really need to dig into what true diversity means. It means women of color. It means our non-binary relatives writing checks. It means more racial diversity, and also making sure that we're not really hiring within like established class systems, people from all walks of life. And not sort of looping us all into one group who's going to, do the right thing without really interrogating those values.
What such an important point, Jacqueline. And I think a lot of it comes back to like, how do you find people that can invest that have had those lived experiences, right? Because if you've never been there and been part of these communities, how can you ever relate to it? So it's such an important point to bring up. A couple of things that you kind of mentioned really stood out to me. One of the big ones is that what you're doing right now with Raven is that your first money in. Such an important concept. And we hear about this over and over and over again, that great founders are always trying to find money, but it's always like in Canada, well, go to someone first. Hopefully they fund it. If they fund you, then maybe we'll follow on after that. So the fact that you're actually able to put belief in these founders and entrepreneurs to say, we'll come in first, is a big message, right? It's a good starting point, and it builds the confidence in allowing them to do this. The other part I love that you mentioned is the increased well-being. Like what a phenomenal perspective to take on investing, is that your every dollar put in has to actually align back to increased well-being of your communities. What all this kind of comes back to, and I think all three of you are touching on this thing, is that we're helping professionalize funds that will support communities, right? This is creating professional funds, not charity funds, and really being able to establish great economic opportunities and leverage to kind of see this kind of move on from there as well. Isaac, I'm going to go to you, and I know, look, this can go on for hours. Believe me, we can't do that today, but I still have a lot of questions to ask before we get into the audience questions, and I have a lot of them on my list. But Isaac, look, nobody can talk about Black innovation programs or Black capital in the country without mentioning your name. In many cases, kind of tell us what you're up to and what's happening in your world, and what you're doing to support the advancement of Black-led companies and startups.
Absolutely. Again, great to hear the two stories. For us, it's a similar journey. It started about 7 years ago with our first engagement with Dan Ryerson, and then it moved to the launch of the Black Innovation Fellowship. And right off the bat, we knew that to start investing in founders, we want to make sure we build the right ecosystem, the right infrastructure, so that it's not just for today, but it lasts substantially throughout all institutions as well too. Engage the institutions in investing, not just our community investing, but having institutional investors see Black founders as an investable community, an investable company as well too. So that's why we launched the Black Innovation Fellowship in partnership with the DMZ to just get that exposure to the industry, which we did. So we got the right mentors, we started to get the right incubators and more Black-led companies into incubators. But then we realized that capital is important. And that's when we launched Bkr Capital. Similar to yourself, everyone thought it would be just a $5 million sort of evergreen fund. But we ended up getting it to $10 million. And then our LPs moved it to $20 million. And we got strong LPs from BDC to CDPQ to RBC. I do want to mention, Toli Lacavera was one of the first individuals to raise his hand to come in on this. And we're excited about what we're now doing and the new capital and the risk dollars that are going into Black founders. And I think that's so important, because when we were talking with RBC and Scotiabank specifically, we talk about all these different loan programs that have gone out to the community. And the question I asked them is that, do you want to take a risk on a Black founder? And they said yes. And that's why they both agreed to be our LPs. So we're changing the perspective of even the type of dollars that are going to Black founders. It's not just loans, but it's strategic risk dollars. Because when you take a risk with a founder, you have more of a care that you want them to succeed. Because you're investing with them, you're opening more doors with them. And we've already seen that with our LPs. But we don't want this to just stop with us. And that's why we're excited with the work we're doing with Dream Legacy Foundation and the federal government. We've now been funded to do research and data. We talked about this before. Without the data, you can't make institutional changes. So now for the next 4 years through Dream Legacy Foundation and probably 10 universities across Canada, we're going to be doing research on Black entrepreneurship. What are the gaps that Black entrepreneurship face when it comes to capital, when it comes to scaling their businesses? And technology is obviously going to be a big component as well. But we're not only going to be talking about founders who are currently here, but new founders that are trying to enter the country from the continent and from the Caribbean. Just last week was Collision, and there was 25 Nigerian founders that were slow in getting their visas, but fortunately they were able to get it last minute, and we were able to provide facility for them at our hotel. But this is an example of the gaps and the issues that founders are having. Is, okay, how do they even expand into Canada? So through Dream Legacy Foundation on the research and data collection point of view, and Bkr Capital on the investment side, we're changing the face of the venture space now.
Amazing. And look, and you've come a long way, Isaac, and I think you've seen there were struggles, trials, and tribulations along the way in trying to get you to this point, and it was never easy. I don't think it was easy for anybody on this call, to be honest with you. And it's sometimes I'd say it's unfortunate that it takes the situation to happen for people to realize how important it is to invest and do better and do more, and kind of, and take and kind of lean in on some of these initiatives. But I got to say, for all of you, this has been what a great journey to undertake, and kind of to lead the way on this one. Arti, I'm going to come back to you, and you spoke about this in your opening, and you said it's not just the right thing to do, it's also the smarter thing to do. And why investing in women-led companies is going to be a greater benefit to the ecosystem at large, and kind of to the country as a whole. Can we just kind of dig into why, how does your investment in women-founded businesses lead you to create better and greater opportunities, and establish and kind of more framework to support even further women to kind of expand their businesses and grow beyond what's already been done? And I gotta maybe add one small point to this. How much education do you include in your work? Like, how much training do you have to do on exposing people to the problem before just actually speaking to the problem itself?
Yeah, great. That's a lot, Abdullah. Lots of questions. I'll try to answer them correctly. I think there's actually a lot of training out there, and there's a lot of information out there. I think the hard thing is like the data. And Isaac, I love that you're all investing in the data and research side, because you can't change what you don't measure. And I think the stats and data out there around women entrepreneurship is still kind of weak. So I love that, Isaac. I think that's really important. For us, I think one of the most frustrating questions I get in terms of like educating, Abdullah, is from people who ask me, and this is usually from other investors, are there enough women businesses to invest in? That's a question I get, and I'm like, what? And so that to me shows how fundamentally broken like even private equity as a whole is, because people don't even assume that there's enough women-led businesses that are the right investments like for private equity, right? Like that to me is like just baseline. People don't understand that. People still think that we're just investing in like hair salons, right? And so these gender deterministic like assumptions come up all the time. And that to me is both frustrating and definitely education that we have to do a little bit more of. I want to speak to the climate right now though, and where I think, investing in women and where my focus as a partner of Backbone is predominantly investing in women of color. And I personally do not like gender deterministic statements, but I actually think this market downturn and quote unquote the R word that is coming in terms of our financial climate is, there's some studies out there, and anecdotally we know this, but there are some studies out there that say that women-owned businesses actually bring in 12% higher revenue than male-owned companies, and see a 35% higher return on investment. And that's from the Kaufman Fellowship program. So we kind of know this anecdotally. And what I think is really interesting about this climate with women raising versus kind of the bull market that we were in is women often have been seen as not fundable because maybe they're not aggressive enough, or maybe they're not thinking big enough. But I think in this kind of bear market that we're in, the resourcefulness and the fiscal conservative side of women is actually going to make them more fundable. And so my big call to action for a lot of people who are thinking about getting into the space, or entrepreneurs that are thinking about raising in this like very precarious time, is this is the time to actually invest in more women. It's not the time to see women as a risk investment. This is the time to see women as like, hey, this might actually be one of my sure bets as an angel investment. So yeah, there's a lot there, Abdullah, that you asked, but I think it's really important to note that like in this very interesting financial climate that we're in, this is the time to double down on women founders, from my perspective.
Love that. And I think it's, you brought up the R word, which we won't say in full, we won't say the full name, but it is a time where it does cause a lot of uncertainty. And I think Jacqueline mentioned earlier around the fact that we were doing better pre-pandemic and investing in women and people of color in their companies. And then the numbers went down drastically, during the pandemic. So as we're shifting into a possible R, can we actually make sure that we don't lose sight of the work that's being done and the opportunity that actually is in front of us to see great economic outcomes from the work that's being done. So it's a great point. Jacqueline, I want to maybe come to you as well and say, what kind of advice would you give to emerging Indigenous entrepreneurs wanting to launch a startup now? And what do investors and supporters of the tech world need to understand and maybe relearn about the community?
Thank you. Well, I just want to mention, I agree. And I love what Isaac said about the need for data. And I know this to be true in the Black community. And I know there has been a lot of study in the women's community, but I just want to share that there is a huge difference. The Indigenous community, particularly in Canada, is the most overstudied, demographic. And our communities have a lot of data extraction fatigue because there's a lot of research done and no action taken. So I'm going to actually share a report in the chat for everyone that is the Mikbam Makwa Ikwe Ice Bear Woman National Needs Assessment on Indigenous women's entrepreneurship. And we, as stewards of the Indigenous entrepreneurship community, in circle with all of our counterparts who are doing lending, who are doing innovation, we have decided to stop applying for money to do more research because it is depleting, funding from going into other areas of entrepreneurial support. So Ashley Richard did an excellent job. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We all contributed to this report, so I'm happy to share it. For Indigenous entrepreneurs starting out, my recommendation is to find peers. And that is one of the reasons that we developed the Fireweed Fellowship, which is the only national Indigenous entrepreneurship accelerator program in the world, actually. And we ran a cohort last year of 24 Indigenous women, non-binary, queer, and two-spirit entrepreneurs. And a lot of the feedback that we got is the most transformational work or resources that were provided was a body of work that we've designed around the trauma of money. Because when you are part of a community that has been legislated into poverty, like the Indigenous community or the Black community or the immigrant community, and you've been subjected to things like redlining, to being forced onto reservations, to having it illegal to hire a lawyer in our community until 1950, or it was illegal for Indigenous people to raise money until 1950. There's a lot of intergenerational personal work that needs to happen. So, so that when you are putting together a forecast or negotiating a term sheet, you don't have a trauma response, leave your body, disassociate, your prefrontal cortex shuts down and you lose access to your creative problem solving skills and executive function. And that's that's not for everyone, but it was a very transformational piece of work that we kind of uncovered through a lot of practice and recognizing that there's so much focus put on financial literacy, but if you are poor, it doesn't matter how financially literate you are. So really flipping, everyone, my 8-year-old son knows that he should spend less money than he has in his piggy bank. That's just basic arithmetic. He doesn't need more financial literacy. What we need is funding. So that's sort of my suggestion for the founders out there, but for our institutional investors, for our government audience, for our funders, I think it's really important. Everything I mentioned at the beginning of sort of how we got to where we are is really heavy. Some of us carry it in our blood memory. It's not comfortable. And, Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun's work on white supremacy culture names 14 characteristics of white supremacy culture, and the right to comfort and fear of open conflict really stand out to me in this regard. Senior leadership, founders, executives, funders have to undertake the deeply uncomfortable and personal work of unlearning white supremacy values before they can lead meaningful change. We see a lot of middle management folks, often women of color and non-binary folks, championing this JEDI work, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and they're burning out because they don't have actual buy-in at the most senior levels. It's not to discourage those people. It's just to say that we have the data. But until people who hold the purse strings or who make the unilateral decisions are on board, there's a risk that all of these diversity activities are window dressing and they're performative. And if they are performative, they're inherently more harmful. So, hiring a whole bunch of junior women and people of color into an organization that is still embodying these values and colonial harms is just opening all of those vulnerable people up to more harm. And often it's done to tick a box to say, well, we met our diversity hire targets, but we didn't actually do the work to make this a safe place to work. So we've seen great shifts in bias training, cluster hiring, I'm a big fan of, and the JEDI work. Employee working groups, but it's disproportionately being led by Black and Indigenous women of color who aren't being compensated fairly for this additional work before they take it on. And I think emotional labor also needs to be compensated and recognized. So, ultimately getting humans with diverse and intersecting identities into all parts and all levels of our organization and the design process and funding process is going to, float all of our boats.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Look, I have so many questions, but I know I'm being selfish. Allow me to transition to some of the audience questions because I'm taking a look through them, and honestly, some of them are really good questions. I'm going to ask that we try to maybe treat it as more rapid fire, just to kind of try to get through a few of these. But I'll point to one person, one of you, and if any of you want to jump in, feel free to do so. Isaac, maybe why don't I start with you on this one? One of the members of the audience said, "What role do allies play in advancing equity in tech and creating forms of sustainability?" Maybe we can, and you've obviously formed a lot of public-private partnerships in the work that you're doing. What role do you typically see in this opportunity?
I think they play the most important role for it to be transferable, institutional, sustainable, and have a really big ripple effect. You need allies. You need institutional allies. You need government allies. You need LPs who are commonly invested in other tech companies that are hitting unicorn status, being part of the cap table of a Black founder, or being on the cap table of a Black-led fund. I think that speaks volume. It speaks credibility. And this is why our strategy was always around building allyship with institutions, both from the university point of view, the incubator point of view, and now the government point of view, and also the banks now. Because like prior to our fund, the banks or government haven't invested. They've provided infrastructure, forms of infrastructure, different loans, but the investment in this area was never being done. So it was very important for us, if we create this, let's make sure that the investment dollars come from institutions that could amplify the work that we're trying to do.
That's awesome. Jacqueline, a quick question for you. And again, I'm pointing these to you because I think it's the right person, but feel free to jump in at any point. We're dealing with a lot of issues in our communities generally, and whether it's a pandemic or different, cost of housing, whatever it may be. How do we make sure that we continue to put our attention towards creating equity and access to communities that we know are being excluded / overlooked? How do we make sure that we don't forget it amongst so many other problems that we're facing in our communities?
That's a great question. I think at an organizational level, creating accountability through declarations, through public commitment to whether it's reconciliation, decolonizing, anti-racism work, and then having budget allocated to developing a meaningful plan that can be seen through, I think is really critical. We're seeing some large government-led funds about to announce their investment thesis, and I'm not going to name names, but I'm happy to say that some of those have an entire pillar dedicated to economic reconciliation. So I think that we have to bake it in. It has to be in the structure of the work that we're doing, or you're right, it can become sort of an add-on or a box to tick that doesn't really drive meaningful change. And again, I'm just going to keep hammering that point home. If the leadership, the C-suite, the executive directors, the board doesn't actually understand how we got here and what is possible if we have more diversity and create more inclusive ecosystems, especially if those data points move the bottom line in a positive way, we're going to continue to see it as, performance.
Arti, I got to ask you a question because you spoke about this in the beginning. And the question is, as I watch my 91-year-old mom master the fine art of video calling on her iPhone, I am reminded of the need to include our older adults in this conversation. How do we ensure we are not forgetting them?
Great question. I just invested in a woman-led startup out of the US. They're second, third-time founders of very traditional companies, and they're both women age 50 plus. And that was a little bit alarming to me when I looked through my portfolio to see how many young people I've invested in, which is very, very, very important. But there are women out there who are older who are developing products that are solving their problem. And this particular company, I'm so passionate about them. They develop incontinence products that are natural, safe, and actually wearable. And I think the problem that they're solving is so important because it is addressing a market that is often overlooked, which is women who are much older, who are facing this problem, but are actually a little bit more digitally savvy, who want to buy their products online faster, just shipped to them. They don't have to compete on Amazon or going to a drugstore because sometimes those products come with a level of shame. And so for me personally, Abdullah, I'm still doing that work when I look at my own portfolio, where it was a little bit alarming to me that this was a different demographic that I had even overlooked. I think it's really important. I think the pandemic really showed, even with my parents, the fact that I was booking all of their vaccine appointments because the portals and everything was so confusing. I think it's really important. I don't think it's going to happen until, especially at the early stage, VCs and angels are looking at these type of products or looking at these problems and meeting founders who are more than capable of solving them, but maybe they just aren't the right ones that are traditionally funded. So I'm still personally doing that work. I don't have any, magic solutions. I think it's hard work, and you got to get out there and you got to meet founders who are solving those correct problems for the aging population.
Awesome. Well, I think part of the work that you're doing is part of the magic. So I think it just keeping on doing that. The question I want to maybe just open up to anybody that feels that they can speak to this is how can we prepare the future generation and students for being agents of change in their future tech careers around equity and access, to make sure that we're not, it's a tough one because, we're talking about the need to change and do better and do more moving forward, but part of that is the next generation and how they apply themselves in doing so. So what is the answer to all our problems moving forward for the generation? Jacqueline, I see your hand up first.
I don't think we have to worry about the youth. I think we should be listening to them because they could teach a master class in this topic.
I agree. Funny enough, I'm watching Downton Abbey right now, which everyone laugh at me because it's like so ridiculous. But it's based at a time where it was right after World War I. And there was so much fundamental change in society where young people didn't want to wear the same clothes. They didn't want to go into these long service jobs. They wanted to have more autonomy over their lives. And I feel like that's what the pandemic did. Like, I feel like the younger generation, who we often complain about not wanting to work as much or wanting to do remote work, I'm kind of tired of people of my generation poo-pooing that and complaining about their young interns, where I'm like, actually, I think this is fundamental change and we're not listening to them. Like, this to me is like post-World War, like World War revolutionary times. And if we don't listen to the young generation, we're screwed. So I actually think they're okay.
Awesome. Isaac, you agree?
I agree.
I'm sure your daughters are telling you how to run the show on your end of the world.
Exactly.
So that's it. I love that. Look, folks, this is thank you so much to the audience, first off, for very thought-provoking questions. Before we wrap up, I wanted to get some final thoughts from each of you, and maybe to bring the theme back here, not to kind of keep dwelling on this, but I think it's an important element that we maybe can touch on a little bit more. But your final thoughts on the turbulent times that are coming ahead. And I know that we're not using the R word, but I'll say the R word, layoffs in hundreds that we're seeing across the communities. Could you all please shed a light on the types of barriers historically excluded communities will face with the market uncertainty that we're experiencing, and how maybe we can support some of these communities in our journeys along the way, and what some of those strategies could look like. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Isaac, will start with you.
Yeah, it's funny. I was listening to a stats on CNN yesterday that said in America, if America catches a cold, the Black community gets sick the worst. And America is about to catch a cold. The economy there's changes happening. So definitely underrepresented groups are going to be impacted the most. And this is why creating allies is so critical. Creating institutional investors is so critical in the work that we're doing, because it's institutions that give a longer runway for businesses when there's issues. But when there's businesses that don't have access to capital that could be extended, don't have access to opportunities that they could still be able to gain when there is an issue, but there's still transactions happening, that's how their businesses or employment fall low, which always happens with which typically always happens with the Black community. So I think the fact that we create a lot of allyship is going to help in Canada with the Black community. The government's on board, institutions are on board, a lot of institutional capital is on board. So that will help weather the storm, unlike the previous times.
Amazing. Arti, want to go next?
Yeah, I have 3 call to actions for the audiences that are listening. One is for the VC, the private equity, the angel community. This isn't the time to slow down on investing in overlooked and excluded founders. That wasn't just a small offside program. Like, this is a business decision, and specifically when it comes to women, they do outperform. So do not stop. It wasn't just like philanthropy. This is a business decision. The second thing is for just the general audience and alumni that's listening. Oftentimes when we go into a bear market, voters end up turning into pocketbook voters. And this is not the time to do that. And I'm going to get political here, but really pay attention to your local representatives and the issues that they stand for. Don't just go based off of historically what political parties represent. And it's really important in Canada not to do that right now. And then third is a little bit of hope for the young people and maybe recent alumni who are listening. I joined the tech ecosystem in 2008. That was a huge market downturn, and there's a lot of opportunity. You may have to take compromises and pay cuts and join companies at a lower level, which honestly, I restarted my career and joined tech as an intern. I'm not saying compromise everything, but I'm saying that in these market downturns, there's a lot of opportunity, and actually this is the best time to start a business. So go out and just do it. This might be the time to do that.
I could not agree more. No better time than the present. And with all the problems that we've been facing, these kind of situations only open up more problem sets that we got to solve for. And who better than obviously than young people that can kind of come in and do this. So that's awesome. Jacqueline, a couple minutes to you.
I hold up every suggestion that's already been made. To Isaac's point, communities that have been historically excluded and marginalized are going to feel the brunt and have felt the brunt of everything, all of the disruption and upheaval. So really investing in those communities. We also see that, particularly Black women and specifically Black queer women have always been the leaders of, the forefront of human rights change. And historically, any systems level change has required deep allyship. So, my silver bullet is like, give all your money to Black women and Indigenous women. As an oversimplification, but if we, as parents, as humans, if we want, the trajectory of our society to shift, that is, a very simple solution that I see. In particular, as we see the rise of further pandemics, on the horizon, a lot of the medicine and the forefront of a lot of these treatments will be coming out of biospheres that are protected by Indigenous matriarchs. This week, to see the stripping away of our most basic human rights and see the further stripping away that lays the path for, I'm pretty terrified for what is to come. And the people who have the most ability to shift that are, in particular, middle-aged, wealthy white men. And so that is who I want to stand, you know, shoulder to shoulder with in driving some of this change. You know, I can whisper in your ear and you can use your voice to really get these messages out there. And that is who, you know, the leadership who is, you know, perpetuating the oppression that we're seeing, that's who they're listening to. And, you know, I have to say, and I know RT has maybe mentioned this as well, the silence from men, particularly cis white men, around what the Supreme Court decision on Friday has been really, really painful. You know, and I know it seems political, but I don't think that like my humanity is a political topic. So it's an encouragement. It's, you know, it's not a call out, it's a call in. We need us all standing together because we can keep investing in tech. And if none of this changes, it's going to get more and more inherently racist. And we're going to see the problems that we've had continue, and our children will experience it at an even more rapid rate.
And thank you so much for that. And on that note, I just wanted to say a big thanks to the three of you for setting the stage, for kind of for setting the standards and getting people to understand more why the work that you do is so incredibly important. A big thanks to the three of you for being awesome on today's panel. Honestly, these are sometimes difficult discussions that need to be said, and I think the way that you said it is incredibly well put, and obviously digestible for a lot of people, whether they understand or don't. Today was a really good discussion. So a big thanks to you, and a huge thanks to our lead sponsor for the Generous Futures panel series, TD Bank Group. Your leadership is truly commendable. I also want to give a big thanks to our promotional partners, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Greater Toronto Chapter, the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, and Community Foundations of Canada. I also want to give a big thanks to Christian and to Laura, who really helped put this whole thing together today. And I know Laura has been chasing all of us and making this truly possible. And finally, a big thanks to the audience for joining us and also submitting some intriguing questions that really got us thinking, and maybe having a lot more time to think even post this panel. Please expect an email in your inbox in the coming days with the link to the recording of this discussion. There's definitely been a lot of great insights today on how we can create more equity and better access for everyone in tech. So I encourage you all to share the recording with your network. And this wraps up the session of the Generous Future series. Thank you again for joining us on these important conversations. Have a great rest of your day and take care.